justice and how we achieve it. And that is in the context of the events we're holding here in Webster's as a parallel to COP26, and the way in which working class communities are those that are most affected by climate change, by pollution, by foul air, by food insecurity, and by poverty. And to my mind, there can be no climate justice without social justice at the same time. And so what we've done this afternoon is got a lovely group assembled of people from different aspects of campaigning. I'm going to ask each of them to outline their cause, their work, and the achievements from it, but above all, how we mobilize and motivate people. And then we'll go into some questions and discussion. And after the contributions are finished, Neil Findlay will come in to describe his work in campaigning and the book that he's just produced, which I'm sure he'd be very happy to sign copies of for you here. And then we'll go into any questions and discussion, and the whole thing will finish maximum 1.5 hours. Okay. And it is being recorded, it is being filmed, and the Project for Justice and Peace, the Peace and Justice Project, is about mobilizing, enabling, and supporting people. It's a home, it's a tent, it's an umbrella, it's a place from which these debates and these discussions go on, so that we can promote solidarity with many causes. So, for example, this morning I had a very long meeting with a group of environmental campaigners from the left in Brazil about the struggles they face in both urban and rural areas. And we've had many other discussions with other groups. So it is international as well as national as well as local, and that's the work that we're trying to do. So if you're not already on our mailing list from the Project for Justice and Peace, please sign up for it. It's very easy to do, and the symbols are all up there. And the panel we've got here today, I'll name them all before we call people to speak, is Bryan Simpson from Unite, who's an organiser of hospitality workers. And hospitality workers are some of the most exploited and those that suffer the greatest levels of abuse and insecurity in their work. Ruth Gilbert from Living Rent Tenants Union, and as there's more and more people living in the private rented sector, which is largely unregulated, grossly exploited, and have the least energy efficient properties anywhere, and therefore they have higher energy bills than anybody else. Graham O'Neill will speak after that from the Scottish Refugee Council, and I'll have to say hats off to all those people that showed solidarity when the Home Office tried to remove some people who were threatened with deportation. It was an inspiration to people all over the country. Thank you very much for all of that. Louise Adamson from Families Against Corporate Killing will give us a harrowing account of what happened to her and her family, but also, in a sense, gives us some empowerment about how we have to mobilise to support and defend people. And so let's try and conclude this meeting when we do in a sense of determination and, above all, optimism, because it's very easy to get yourself into a sort of miasma of depression that it's all impossible and hopeless. No, it's not. It's up to us to change things, and that surely is what the spirit of all of our parallel events to COP are about. I have to say there's a kind of a world of difference between what's happening in that bubble down the road and what's happening in places like this all over this city and indeed all over the world at the present time. So thank you very much for coming again, and can we start with Bryan, and I'm going to ask each contribution to be reasonably brief. I don't know how long you need, but sort of 5-10 minutes would be appropriate if you could please. Bryan, over to you first, and welcome.
Thanks, Chair. I can't believe that the chair is Jeremy Corbyn. That's a good start.
You don't know how good about a chair I am.
It's been a difficult month, as well. It's been a difficult 20 months for Glasgow's workforce, but particularly Glasgow's hospitality workforce. Since March last year, 30,000 baristas, housekeepers, croupiers, waitresses have lost their jobs in this city alone. According to Forth, which is the most trusted employee data software in the industry, the hospitality workforce shrunk by 26% last year alone. That equates to 650,000 job losses across the UK. That would eclipse anything that's came before it in the sector. Of course, the vast majority of these workers weren't terminated by small family-run businesses who were struggling to get by. They were terminated by multinationals who sought to use the pandemic to restructure their companies, to minimise labour costs and maximise profits. Behemoths like the Marriott Group, the largest hotel chain in the world, a company that despite the pandemic still made £3 billion last year. They refused to furlough any of their casual workers because they did not want to pay the national insurance and pension contributions, which would have amounted to a grand total of £150 per worker per month. For 3 months, these workers received absolutely no wages from March to June. Or the Compass Group, the largest hospitality employer in the world, which terminated 630 casual workers at Scotland's largest hospitality venue. Where is that venue? The Scottish Events Campus, where COP is being held today. A venue that's 90% owned by Glasgow City Council, a venue that, as I said, 2 miles away, the Great and the Good are meeting. Or the G1 Group, which many of you will be aware of, if not have worked for. They terminated 2,000 workers by phone. Stephen King got his 60 general managers to phone up and sack all 2,000 casual workers, despite the job retention scheme. Or the Casual Dining Group, the owners of Bella Italia, Café Rouge and Las Iguanas, they invited 1,900 workers onto a conference call with 24 hours notice and made them all redundant. No notice, no consultation, no opportunity to put forward alternatives. In each of these examples though, instead of accepting what was being done to them, these workers got together with their colleagues, they joined a union, many for the first time, and they fought back. They forced some of the biggest hospitality employers in the country, not only to reinstate them on 80% wages, but some of them got 100% wages and even premium payments for those who worked through the pandemic. At the G1 Group, our members immediately got to work organising their colleagues. They launched a national social and mainstream media campaign aimed at the already battered reputation of the infamous employer. And within 48 hours, the company was forced into an embarrassing U-turn and reinstated all 1,900 workers. At the Marriott, a workforce of majority young women and migrant workers clubbed together, they demanded fair and equitable treatment, and they won. They not only won 80% wages, but they won it backdated for 3 months. At the Scottish Events Campus, our members launched a mass collective grievance, a public media campaign, which forced Compass not only to reinstate them, but to pay them 100% wages, but also to pay them £12.30 an hour in what became the Louise, the venue that held the vaccination centres. As a direct consequence of that win, Compass have just agreed a new venues agreement with Unite, which will apply across every single venue in the UK, which includes the Excel Centre in London, Wimbledon, Wembley, Twickenham. And in that agreement, they commit to the real living wage of at least £10 an hour, regardless of age, implementing a proactive sexual harassment policy, and offering minimum hour contracts, and most importantly, granting Unite access to 70 venues across the UK. And where will that be rolled out first? The Scottish Events Campus, because that's where we actually fought back and won. From a small group of young hospitality workers taking action to stop unnecessary redundancy back in April last year, their action will now positively affect 62,000 hospitality workers. For years, we've been told that hospitality is impossible to organise, that these are simply young, naive workers in transition jobs. But during the most difficult of times, we have proven that that is beautifully wrong. And now in Glasgow, we've got a branch of 2,500 housekeepers. The chair, Caitlin Lee, is sitting over there right now. This is chefs, waitresses, croupiers, housekeepers who are organising against some of the most exploitative conditions you could imagine, as Jeremy said. Fire and rehire, poverty pay, 0-hour contracts, and sexual harassment. Of course, we've got a long history in this city of workers in the face of austerity and mass redundancy taking creative action to fight back. It's 50 years this year since 6,000 shipyard workers in the Upper Clyde refused to accept the Heath government diktat to close their workplace and led one of the most important industrial actions of the 20th century. They knew that if they just occupied the yards, they would be forced out in days by the full force of the state. So they developed a plan to keep the plant open, or to keep the workplace open, using cooperation and solidarity rather than micromanagement to build ships faster and better. It was a genius stroke which brought the people of Glasgow behind them and forced Heath to back down and invest millions to keep the yards open for years to come. This is exactly what the cleansing workers are doing with GMB at the moment. They are, through Twitter, through modern means of communication, getting out to thousands of Glaswegians and workers across the country. That's why they are winning. I recently had the pleasure of speaking alongside the workplace leaders at the Lucas aerospace plant in Birmingham. For those that don't know, these are workers who 45 years ago were faced with redundancy, and instead of accepting that, they put together the Lucas plan, which effectively put together a list of 150 socially useful products. Rather than making bombs and fighter jets, they made heat fuel pumps. They made ventilators for hospitals. We learned from the workers of Lucas and Upper Clyde that politicians don't make decisions for the benefit of our class unless we force them to. And that's why during COP, alongside cleansing workers, teaching assistants, rail and bus workers, the hospitality workers of Glasgow who have been serving the world leaders in £800 a night hotels where they're getting £1 per room to clean it. They're demanding a bigger slice of the pie, as well as direct actions outside some of the city's poshest hotels on the 9th of November. Just on Tuesday there, we brought together workers from across the world to develop international organising strategies aimed at driving up standards across the lowest paid and the most precarious sector, linking together the fight for climate justice and workers' rights. Glasgow cleansing workers on the same panel with Colombian cleaners fighting against fire and rehire at Hilton, Norwegian chefs campaigning against sexual harassment, and Sheraton workers in Guinea taking strike action in solidarity with colleagues unfairly dismissed. We also heard from Fridays for Future, the teenagers who brought 40,000 people to the streets of Glasgow on Friday, demanding immediate action on the climate. Their message, and ultimately the message of today and this whole 2 weeks, is simple. Working people run this city, they run this economy. They may not make the decisions, and they certainly don't get as big a slice of the pie as they deserve, but they are the wealth creators and they are the system changers. Not politicians or business owners or oil and gas lobbyists who are in the blue zone. And it's only by combining the strategies of mass industrial action of our labour movement with the disruptive tactics of the environmental movement that we're going to force the necessary action from world leaders. That is our task, comrades. Let's finish what we've started here in Glasgow. Thanks.
Bryan, that's a fantastic list of achievements, and the struggle that you have organised and led is absolutely brilliant there. And the fact that you've got union access to another 70 venues, that seems to me the key to the future. So the future for hospitality and catering is unions and organising. Okay? I'm going to ask Ruth Gilbert from Living Rent Tenants Union to describe the struggles she's been involved in and they've been involved in.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here today. As mentioned, I'm a member of Living Rent, Scotland's Tenants Union, and I'm based in the Govanhill branch here in Glasgow. I'm going to talk briefly on a couple of campaigns, one at the local level and one at the national level, which speak to the grassroots work being done in our union right now. From our experiences of COP26, it's clear that there is a vast disconnect between the interests of the workers and residents of Glasgow and those of the leaders of our city and country. We've heard talk of Glasgow's green vision, we've seen the chirpy PR campaigns and the fawning selfies, but none of this speaks to our experiences in our own communities. So on that note, I want to draw attention to the Waste Crisis campaign that Living Rent has been organising with the GMB cleansing workers in Glasgow for the past year. In the winter of 2020, the Govanhill branch voted to prioritise a local campaign on cleansing. At that time, it was a relatively new branch without a formal organising committee, but what we were all talking about on Zoom meetings was how we were feeling about the overflowing bins and the unsanitary back courts where kids were not able to play during what we now know was the longest lockdown period of anywhere in Britain. The streets of Govan Hill were heavily policed during COVID restrictions, and having limited access to safe and clean back courts was only compounded by this intense police presence. As we know, lockdown was not the same for everyone. So from the off, we were working with the GMB on this because we knew that residents and cleansing workers alike were facing terrible conditions on account of council austerity. The cleansing workers, like many key workers, were risking their lives and being treated appallingly. And I'd like to make clear that Glasgow City Council's attempt to blame residents and workers has failed from the very start. We were never going to be divided on this issue. It's cuts that have caused this crisis, not working class people. So our approach has been solidly cross-union, with tenants and workers standing together. And this was a really positive way for us to fight back against cuts that affect us all, from essential workers on the lowest wages to people living in the most impoverished areas. We noted with disgust the attempts to sow division from various quarters, and we absolutely refuted claims from Susan Aitken that Glasgow merely has some quote-unquote problematic patches which simply need, in her words, a spruce up. That's not only offensive, but clearly designed to let the council off the hook for their own cuts to services. So our demands in this campaign are clear. We want a return to 2014 staffing levels for the cleansing workers, which will improve the lives of residents across Glasgow while creating new jobs. We want a cap on Glasgow City Council employing agency staff set at 5%. We want a reversal of the prohibitive bulk uplift charge so that working class communities can access this service. We want a return of dedicated backcourt teams, and we want a return to the weekly collection cycle of 2014. Living Rent and the GMB have stood together on this for over a year on demands for greater investment. However, we know that this crisis has not come about overnight. This campaign clearly speaks to a wider issue of neglect and degradation of our city over a period of decades and far beyond the term of this council alone. From libraries to cleansing to transport and our architectural heritage and green space, citizens of Glasgow are being played. I don't know about anyone else here, but the image of the Winter Gardens attached to the People's Palace, no less, which circulated last week, really became a symbol of all of this for me. In its neglected and abandoned state, it summed up the mood in the city as delegates started arriving. It is cultural and social sabotage. And so this Waste Crisis campaign is part of that bigger picture. It's a way to mobilise around an issue which is symptomatic of the evident failures of Glasgow City Council's austerity politics. So how did we build this campaign? First, we planned a Govan Hill Day of Action in December of last year. This galvanised support for the campaign, and through 1,500 signatures won the branch initial negotiations with the council. But they began stonewalling us in spring of 2021. So in agreement with the GMB and Living Rent branches in Denniston, Govan and Partick, we voted to take the campaign citywide to gain more power and traction. The weekend before last, before the GMB strike action commenced, we took the scale of the crisis to the council's front door at the city chambers in a citywide day of action. We collected and dumped waste from all over the city at George Square. Currently, there's a little gate that prevents access on that road leading in front of the city chambers. But who could say why that went up on the Monday morning following our action? What's critical to this campaign and our demands is that it shows a clear connection between the rights and conditions of workers and the impact those conditions have on communities and public services, as well as sustainability and a just transition. It's clear that the city's residents and workers want the same thing: a clean environment brought about by proper investment in a well-resourced and properly paid workforce. This campaign, to me, really exemplifies the best of social justice work, that being cross-union solidarity, building community power, and standing shoulder to shoulder in a set of joint demands. During this past week, Living Rent have been out in force, standing with the striking cleansing workers on their picket lines, and this solidarity only grew as strike-breaking tactics ramped up. It is an absolute sin that the key workers risking their lives throughout the pandemic were and are paid a poverty wage. So we are absolutely united in our aims, because when the workers win, we all win. So on Monday morning, following months of sustained cross-union action, Glasgow City Council committed to getting back around the table with Living Rent to negotiate for the investment this city needs. There's a way to go, but this win shows how strong we are when we stand together in our fight for justice. Before I pass back to the chair, I want to highlight very briefly a national Living Rent priority that speaks to climate justice as social justice and how the union has been campaigning around the private sector and social sector on green refurbishment. It's critical that the conversation around refurbishment pays close attention to who this will hit hardest. Pushing for that just transition means investment in public services and more jobs, but it also means the cost of refurbishment not falling on tenants. Everyone's talking about this amazing opportunity to tackle health, climate change and jobs, and that's all grand, but we want to make sure that tenants aren't left footing the bill. We know that housing precarity creates the perfect terrain for landlords to exploit tenants far beyond this single issue, but working class people should not be exploited under the radar as refurbishment work is carried out. And so the demands around refurbishment are very clearly linked to rent controls, as committed to by the Scottish Government during the run of this Parliament. But we want to make sure that as eco-efficient work ramps up for landlords, that any cost should not be pushed onto tenants through rising rents. So pushing for rent caps goes hand in hand here, and no one is simply going to give us those rent caps. So on that, Living Rent is working to tie rent controls to energy efficiency so that unjust hidden charges can be prevented. We cannot sit and watch landlords in the private or social sector bumping up rents to pay for essential charges which are the responsibility of property owners. The transition to a greener future should not come at the expense of the most vulnerable. Instead, refurbishment across private, social and council rentals should be met by major investment, which in turn will create more jobs. There's concern around how landlords will do this work, so on a practical level, we need sanctions on landlords who don't meet their targets under a fair system of rent caps, as well as making sure new social housing and other rentals prioritise energy efficient materials from the off. So this is the bit of the conversation around refurbishment and climate justice that to Living Rent is a bit absent, and it needs to be said and it needs to be built upon in the coming years as we push for rent controls. I'll close now by saying that, as we all know, it's important that working class people know this is our fight too. The momentum around climate change as a social justice issue isn't difficult to chart, and it troubles me to hear place or anything as boundaried as that. We are campaigning in our own communities where we live by knocking on doors and saying, are you seeing these changes? What does that mean for you and your rent? Can you afford it? And how is your landlord or housing association handling that? So to me, that's a way of mobilising climate justice for the working class. This is our fight because, as we all know, the working class in Scotland and in communities across the world are bearing the burdens of climate change at a rate exponential to that of the ruling class. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Were Mary Barber still alive, she'd have agreed with every word you said. She is one of the great heroines of Clydeside, in my view. Can we now put your hands together to welcome Graham O'Neill from the Scottish refugee camps? And I just open this particular point by just saying that refugees never choose to be refugees. No kid growing up in poverty with environmental disaster going on around and wars or human rights abuses ever dreams of being a refugee. They dream of getting to a place of safety. Can we tell Boris Johnson, Priti Patel and everybody else, they're human beings just like all of us, and they deserve our support, our love and our sympathy, just like every other human being.
Thank you, Jeremy. I couldn't agree more on behalf of Scottish Refugee Council, and just to thank you as well for inviting us to come and talk today. As you can hear, I'm from Glasgow. It's a city very close to my heart, and I've lived in different parts of the country, the UK. But one of the things that really strikes me about Glasgow is it has got an amazing social justice campaigning heritage. When Dad's from Govan, he worked in the shipbuilding industry. He would tell me about the power of trade union organising as I was growing up, and as I moved into my adult life, that's really struck me. Is, you know, we all know in our hearts when somebody's being authentic and when somebody's speaking the truth. You know, we have enough about us to sense that, and it's very true what we have in Glasgow. And I just wanted to kind of start by talking a little bit about Glasgow, and particularly how inspiring it is and how many inspiring people we have that fight for refugee and migrant justice. There's people not here today, but I really wanted to kind of stress, there's people like Yvonne Blake from the Moore Collective, who, I wasn't at the demonstration in Glasgow. The migrant justice bloc was led by Moore, it was led by people, and we need to recognise and say that. So I wanted to use the platform just to say that it's, and also in Glasgow we've been the biggest, the Home Office's jargon, the asylum dispersal system, it's been around for 20 years, but it's basically the system that the Home Office have had for 20 years, for a generation, to move people away from London in the southeast, people who are coming here seeking safety, and to different parts of the UK. And Glasgow has been the biggest asylum dispersal area for those 20 years. And it's been working class communities where I come from myself, that have been the ones that have been welcoming people. It's been Govan, it's been Calntine, it's been Milton, it's been Springburn. Working class communities get it. They get solidarity. Their identity, their heritage is built in solidarity. They get kindness. Nobody's perfect, but people get it. And Glasgow's welcomed, by and large, people that have came in. To me, that's no accident, that's happened. We've had some amazing campaigns in this city. Circle 3 years ago, in August 2018, tried to lock change people out of their accommodation. Think about that. Immediately, you are out your accommodation. You come home from the shops. You come home for a doctor's appointment. Even with one of this case, maybe I should say it, there was a man that, through his lawyer, had to go to a hospital. It wasn't a doctor's, a hospital appointment, and he told, being honest and being responsible, the Home Office in Circle, that he was going to that, and he came back and his house had been lock changed. We never got that man back to that accommodation. We put him into other accommodation. But the point is that here you had a multinational company, Circle in this case, delivering a public service of critical importance to somebody, having accommodation, critical importance to everybody, for people in homeless predicaments, or people whose lives have been disrupted, as refugees by definition have been. To not have that place of safety and privacy and sanctuary tells you that for that just to be taken so quickly by a company like Circle in an unaccountable way 3 years ago. And Glasgow didn't stand for it. Glasgow fought back. So here we are over 3 years on, through court cases, through grassroots campaigning, through direct action, through really excellent legal and advocacy work. There's hundreds of people that would have been made street homeless in Glasgow, but haven't been. And that's precious, that's really practical stuff. But I digress a little bit. I suppose my starting point I wanted to say was, aside from that, was, that we at Scottish Refugee Council, I think as a refugee movement, we work with people that are suffering, displacement all the time, that tell us what displacement means, that their lives have become unlivable in places for different reasons that are their homes. So, we listen actively to people, and, we very much clearly see the injustices that have been perpetrated by the global north, the rich global north, for generations. Makes really clear to us that refugee migrant justice is completely issues of climate and wider socioeconomic injustice. Again, it's one of those self-evident things that we kind of know in our hearts is true, and we should never let that be swayed or divided or separated. They're all interlinked. And a lot of it comes from racism, a lot of it comes from that kind of systemic, institutional devaluation of people and their homes, areas that have been plundered for generations and centuries. We need, as I think Bryan was very eloquent articulate, we really need that solidarity across different communities, across the world. It's really inspiring to hear the organising that he's been doing on that, because let's face it, look over there at the SCCC, it's like all security, all the private cars, all these business leaders, all these political leaders, and that is generated a bubble. I mean, they're not going to give the solutions, are they? Let's face it, they're not going to come up with the solutions, because this is COP26. And the clue to me is in the name, and to us is in the name, COP26. 26 times, you know, that people have been talking about this. The solutions will come from the people themselves and communities forcing the change. We work in a system, the asylum system, which has been, it's been a real contortion of what it should be. You know, the international community came together after the horrors of the Holocaust and said, enough is enough. We can't have people abandoned in that time in Europe with nowhere to go. We need to make sure we learn that people can actually access safety through different means. Because the people that are persecuting you aren't going to give you a visa. The Taliban aren't going to give an Afghan a visa. You know, so the Refugee Convention recognises that real world reality that people are in. But that right has been devalued systemically in the UK for 20 years, and I'll get to why I think we're heading for a new nadir in a minute or so. But just to kind of like sketch out, many people know this better than me in the room, what that devaluation looks like. You know, for 20 years we've had a systemic denial of fundamental socioeconomic and political rights for people seeking refugee protection in the UK. So, you know, people are not allowed to work. People don't have a choice anywhere in terms of accommodation that they're put into. People are given financial support on a no-choice basis, which amounts, if you're in a hotel room, isolation, or a barracks in the UK at the moment, to £1 per day. If it's you're in residential accommodation within communities where people should be, then what people get is £39 per person per week. So that's 40% of the value below the social security minimum. It's UK state-sanctioned absolute poverty. That's what it is. That's what it's experienced as, and it's grassroots communities that actually come in and stop people at scale, essentially dying and essentially suffering severe malnourishment. But many people, as I'll get to, do lose their lives, and we've been trying to work with others to expose that grim reality in recent times. So the consequence of this kind of fundamental denial of socioeconomic rights, deliberate denial, is destitution, it is exploitation, it is people losing their lives. You know, there's 70 people in the asylum accommodation system in the last 18 months have lost their lives in that system that's supposed to keep them safe. And that's about a fivefold increase to the preceding 3 years. And we suspect it's more. And we'll continue to campaign with others at Amnesty, Liberty Investigates, and The Guardian to bring that out. Because those people matter. They have loved ones, you know, they have memories, they matter. We're not going to let those people be rendered invisible. But as I said, we're approaching a new nadir within the refugee protection system within the UK. Jeremy mentioned Priti Patel as Home Secretary at the moment. And the Home Secretary's dreadfully weaponised asylum in her new plan for immigration that was presented to the UK Parliament in March this year, then followed up about 2 months later with the Nationality and Borders Bill. It's an anti-refugee bill, it's an anti-safety bill in practice, and I want to explain why we describe it as such. I suppose the first thing is this is a kind of new front in the hostile environment against migrants within the UK. It's cold, it's calculated, it's dehumanising people who come here seeking safety. Essentially what it institutes is a refugee punishment regime. And getting back to first principles of why we have a right to asylum in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it should be something we're proud of. It should not be this gross contortion of what the UK government, successive UK governments, have articulated it as, and the current one is taken, as I say, to a new nadir. But that's all well me saying this. I want to explain very briefly why I say that. The first part is to say that this Nationality and Borders Bill institutes a refugee punishment regime for people that are fleeing often punishment from state and non-state actors by severing the link with the UK state and the Refugee Convention. So the UK government, you'll hear them saying that they interpret the Refugee Convention. They do no such thing. They sever the link with the Refugee Convention. So that's 70 years that convention has been for, and here we have a short-term government, short-term Home Secretary coming in and actually severing the UK state's link with with a convention that continues to has saved millions of people's lives. But that's what's actually happening at the moment within Parliament. And it severs it by breaking the key principle that people who arrive irregularly through unauthorised means, refugees, it's about 3/4 of refugees in the UK do this because by necessity they don't have the papers or the documents to be able to enter a territory because they can't get it from those from which they flee. It's self-evident, it's why the Refugee Convention stood the test of time, because it gets it. It's in the real world, not in some dangerous fantasy, ideological world where this nationality borders bill is. And what it actually then does is it marks somebody as a Group 2 refugee. That's what it says, it's a Group 2 refugee for the 70–80% of people that arrive in the UK. That's deliberate dehumanising language. These are people from Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, Vietnam, Iran. And I mention those countries because these are all countries that the current UK system recognises as high rates of refugee recognition. It takes a long time to get those decisions, but that's what it is. So at one fell dreadful swoop, this nationality and borders bill will remove people who today the UK state, after a long time, recognises as refugees. This time next year, they will not be recognised as refugees. They will be Group 2 refugees. And what a Group 2 refugee is, the first penalty, the first punishment is you're liable to the criminal offence of unlawful arrival. Up to 4 years imprisonment, a jury trial, 12 months minimum prison, if it's done through the summary. So that's the stakes we're talking about here. So a woman fleeing the Taliban, when this bill's come in, will be liable for the criminal offence of unlawful arrival and face up to 4 years in prison. That's what's getting done in Parliament in our name at the moment, and we must reject it, we must organise against it. The second is you'll get put into an isolated accommodation centre. In practice, it's de facto detention. We've all seen the stuff at Napier Barracks. There's 20,000 people in hotel room isolation across the UK at the moment. And people are getting £1 a day in that accommodation. They've got no control over their lives, no agency. It's dehumanising in the legislation, it's dehumanising in practice. No choice about the food they have. Remember, they've got £1 a day, no choice of the food you've got. You know, the private company might do a deal with some food production company, and that's the choices you get, whatever they give you. So the malnourishment arrives very quickly upon people. And even if the Home Office, thankfully they don't have the removal agreements in place to make this happen, and we hope they never do, or the offshore processing arrangements, but even if the Home Office can't remove you or offshore somebody, then the most that they will give to somebody seeking safety is temporary protection status. It is not refugee leave. It is not 5 years limited leave to remain without route to settlement to rebuild your life here. It is 2.5 years of, at the most, of temporary protection status, and you will be no recourse to public funds condition placed upon you. Without wanting to talk too much in a dreadful metaphor, it's sink or swim, even if your Home Office recognise you. Because you won't, if you have no recourse to public funds, have access to homelessness assistance, and you won't have access to social security or any passported benefits that stem from not having access to social security. Neil's, I've worked with Neil in the past in cases, and just to say how tremendous an MSP Neil has been in these matters in West Lothian to help people who have no recourse to public funds. He knows very much what it is like. So really the stakes are very high in terms of the Nationality and Borders Bill. And I just wanted to kind of final concluding remarks to say that this isn't an aberration what's happening here in the UK. It's extreme, but it's not an aberration as compared to what other global north states are doing within Europe especially. You know, it's actually sitting very comfortably within a global north, hostile environment to people from the global south. Habitual exploitation of the global north to the global south, including the climate emergency, which has very much made homes in areas that are precious to people to become unlivable. Resources have been depleted and extracted for the gains of mass consumerist lifestyles in the global north, selfish lifestyles. Ted Hondrick put it well in his study of conservatism that I read 10 or so years ago. You go, what is actually going on in that small c conservatism, this organised selfishness that's going on in the global north? Shit are culpable for doing that. We're seeing very much viscerally now, again, in Europe, what is happening in terms of global north migration policy and practice, the unedifying reality of dangerous and fatal pushbacks for our fellow human beings into the sea, into freezing forests at Poland and Belarus. Now people are dying there, trapped in trucks, and trapping people into detention and slavery conditions in camps. Look what's happening in parts of Libya at the moment. The EU, Europe is involved in condoning an awful lot of that. So I think we need to remind ourselves that, you know, that governments in the rich north and the private interests that are working with companies like Serco, companies like G4S, it's a very unsavoury alliance, and they're suiting themselves when it comes down to the hard reality of it. And I'm trying to sketch out some of the realities of that and the risk that it get a lot worse. So very much for us in the refugee and migrant justice movement, we don't trust what's happening over there at the SCCC. And we don't trust it because the people that are saying declarations and commitments are those same people that are perpetrating these hostile and violent pushback and fatal policies at times in terms of migration and refugee issues. But the people themselves and communities know that, and they need to just force the issues. So I suppose my final concluding point, I promise, is that the causes of injustice are intertwined, and the solutions must therefore be intertwined as well. Migrant and refugee justice is an issue of climate justice, and it is an issue of wider socioeconomic injustice. So we are campaigning against this anti-refugee, anti-safety bill and the wider global north pushback. Please connect it with the climate and justice. We'll do our best to do the same, and hopefully through that we will be able to overcome some of the challenges. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and all I can say is that I agree with everything you've said, and that this bill that's going through the UK Parliament at the moment also defies the law of the sea, which is a universal law which requires all seafarers to protect any other seafarer in peril on the sea. Very basic law. And so we will end up at this rate with prosecutions for the Royal National Lifeboat Institution for saving refugee lives in the Channel. It's utterly disgusting what's going on. Thank you for the work you do, and thank you for what you've said. Can I now, before we go to Neil to bring the many good threads together, ask Louise Adamson from Families Against Corporate Killing to describe the situation that she was in a particular case, but also the generality of corporate power, please.
Okay, well, I'm here today because my wee brother's dead. He was electrocuted at work at the age of just 26. And like so many who are sharing their stories of how climate change is impacting their lives, I share my family's pain in order to effect positive change in, for me, the field that is health and safety. You see, my wee brother's dead because his employer didn't see health and safety as an important enough priority. So I now do what I do in order to try to convince others that health and safety should be an absolute priority. Indeed, that a healthy and a safe workplace should be a fundamental right, should it not? But, well, many are at a total loss to understand why we're even having to seek to convince the International Labour Organization that health and safety should, in fact, be recognised as a fundamental right at work, because it currently isn't, but it should be. You see, it's fundamentally wrong that a wife should need to write heartbreakingly about her 60th year on the grief roller coaster, missing her beautiful angel husband so much with every passing hour of her life. It's fundamentally wrong that a mum should be marking the 18th year since her 17-year-old son was taken from her. The pain she feels never healing, instead festering like an open wound. And it's fundamentally wrong that my brother's fiancée should have gone from choosing wedding cars to sitting in a funeral cortege. So in seeking to convince the International Labour Organization to recognise health and safety as a fundamental right at work, I join with others in seeking to do that. Because as well as being a trustee of health and safety charity Scottish Hazards, which has done so much to support workers with advice and support during this pandemic, I also am a member of a campaign group whose name is unashamedly designed to make folks sit up and take that wee bit of notice. Families Against Corporate Killers, or FAC for short. Now the FAC families, or the FACers, as we obviously like to refer to ourselves as, you see, our hearts break all over again each and every time we hear that a work-related fatality was an accident waiting to happen. In terms of the climate disaster which currently looms, we hear it referred to as a health emergency waiting to happen. It's no longer waiting to happen, it is happening. And we hazards campaigners and FACers, we've said many things repeatedly over the years, and we can't help but draw parallels between our social justice agenda and that of climate justice campaigners. We remember all of the dead, having repeatedly implored that each and every work-related fatality should be recognised, should be counted, and therefore should be made to count. The HSE figure of 142 fatalities last year, it doesn't include those who die in maritime or air incidents, who die on our roads while working, those who die by work-related suicide. It doesn't count members of the public who die because of work-related activities. And it doesn't count the huge numbers who are killed by occupational illness. When all of those lost loved ones are counted, as they damn well should be, we reach near 1,500 who die in work-related incidents, and a further 50,000 who die as a result of work-related illnesses here in the UK each and every year. The ILO and WHO recently estimated that globally, nearly 2 million deaths are attributable to work-related causes. The International Trade Union Congress, they say, look, even that's an underestimate. The real figure is nearer 3 million. But unless this true toll is set out in plain sight, the depth of impact, it can't be measured. The lessons, they can't be learned, and future needless loss of life can't be prevented. So just how are we going to track deaths at work caused by heat exhaustion or by air pollution? How are we ensuring that new green jobs aren't exposing workers to new carcinogens or other new hazards? When you factor in that the WHO and ILO figures, they don't even currently factor in deaths due to silicosis. We know there's a hell of a long way to go to make sure that all work-related deaths due to climate change are going to be counted and can therefore be made to count. I tell you who it'll fall to. It'll fall to those who operate our hazard centres and the hazards campaign. Those trade union safety reps who fight with every ounce of their being for hearts and minds and to prevent future loss of life. They'll seek to keep track of these losses and the reasons for them because it will inform their preventative action. We know that trade union workplaces are safer workplaces, whether that be day to day or when battling a pandemic, and that trade union workplaces are also greener workplaces. So it should be important that the role of an environmental rep is one in its own right. It's not an add-on to the duties of a health and safety rep, and that statutory recognition is given. The hazards movement repeatedly hammers home that the work a person does often results from inequality, and that it often results in health inequality. The lower your pay grade, the higher your health and safety risks, whether from overwork, exposure to cancer-causing substances, the inability to turn down time and shift work, or the worry about speaking up about health and safety for fear that you're going to lose your job. We must counter all of this. Priorities properly, reiterating that we didn't and we won't vote to die at work. We'll instead continue the work of getting to a point where never again does a loved one leave home in a works van and return in one belonging to an undertaker. Because just when does a family's journey begin? Is it when that loved one leaves home to go to work with the intention of making a better and a fuller life for themselves, for their families, for us? Or did it begin when we got the harrowing call to say that our loved one had been in an accident, when the police appeared at our door in scenes we thought we'd only ever see on TV? when we ourselves set off for the hospital, not knowing what condition we're going to find our loved ones in, or when the organ donor nurse calls to tell us that they're now at peace. The ending of our loved one's life, it began our own lifelong journey, and it's also fundamentally wrong. Have we been looking at this all wrong? Does our journey in fact begin when our loved one's employer decides that the health and safety of its workforce just wasn't an important enough priority? Does it begin when decisions are taken, or indeed are not taken, and as a result our partner or parent, sibling or child, friend or family member is then exposed to the hazardous substance, process or work environment which results in their death? Are we on this journey because government decided that hard-won legislative protections should be stripped back and that calls for legislative improvement should be knocked back? Do we travel this road because our enforcement authorities have had their abilities to carry out proactive preventative inspections stifled because their governance and their resources in to the ravages of climate change, and that we build a world of work that is safer and healthier, life-giving, not life-ending.
Louise, thank you so much. In memory of that beautiful life, let's try and achieve all of those things. Thank you. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you. Now, Neil, whose book has just been published and has got a lifetime of campaigning successfully on many, many issues and being the most brilliant representative of his community and his people in every walk of life that he's been campaigning, and is now going to try and bring some of these threads together and talk about campaigning work. And I've known Neil for a long time and worked with him for a long time, and I'm so proud that he's on this platform today. I'm so proud of the work he's doing with Tommy and Michael in setting up this group of union communications, which are helping so much to develop our campaigning skills and ability. Neil.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to the panel. I think that has been very inspirational one and very humbling to be on the panel with you. I kind of want to set what we've been talking about in a bit of context and go back a wee bit. If we go back to the financial crash of the mid-2000s, we saw global capitalism hit by probably the biggest earthquake there's been since the 20s. And some of the biggest companies, the biggest institutions that everyday brands on our TV every day were exposed as the cheats and liars and fraudsters, tax avoiders that most of us knew they were anyway, but they were exposed as that. The Tesco's, the RBS's of this world, Lehman Brothers, remember all of that, Starbucks, all of that went on at that time, the ripping off the taxpayer, ripping off their employees, corrupt to the core, the free market exposed for what it is. We saw directors on telephone number, salaries, tax avoidance schemes that were just the way they operated, and all of that going on. And I thought the other day, what kind of COP26 conference do we have when Jeff fucking Bezos is there lecturing us about how to save the planet, because he is one of the biggest culprits in all of this. But all of that went on during that period when the financial crash hit. And meanwhile, in the real world, in our world, we had rising unemployment, we had the massive expansion of food banks, people forced into grinding poverty, the return of rickets. We have inequality in this country, in this city, that is reportedly as bad as it is in the Palestinian state. We have a division within our communities. And then across the EU, we had the imposition of austerity. A multinational cross-EU policy imposed by the European Commission, the IMF, the European Central Bank, who waltzed into countries, not one of these people ever elected, waltzed into countries and imposed austerity and an economic policy on them. Look at what happened in Ireland when these men and women in grey suits turned up and basically wrote the Irish economic policy. Look what happened in Greece when the Greek people elected a left government to reject all of that, and yet had their manifesto ripped up for them and told that this is what you're going to do, or else the EU, who, by the way, encouraged them, remember, to go into the euro and all the rest of it under false pretenses. If you don't accept this, then this is what's going to happen to you. And what happened was we saw privatisation of services, we saw massive cuts to public services, pensions reduced, the welfare state decimated, and we saw the creation of the Fortress Europe that Graham was talking about, people dying on dinghies in the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe, and yet people believe Europe has some sort of progressive policy in welcoming migrants. It's all right, you can have free movement within Europe, but don't come to our border, you ain't getting in. I was in Venezuela election monitoring in 2012, I think it was, or 13, and I spoke to a mayor of a Greek town, and he was on the delegation. He told me that in his town, the public service cuts were so bad that if a woman in hospital had a baby, the hospital kept the baby until the woman turned up to pay the bill in Europe in 2012 or 2013. So why am I saying this? Well, the market took us to that position. Capitalism took us to that position. That's the prevailing orthodoxy. And if you heard some of the crap that we're hearing from the conference down the road, I heard Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, tell us the other day that it would be technology and clever people in business who would resolve the climate crisis. These are the very people who created the climate crisis, and yet we're supposed to believe they will bring the solution. But this is where we've got to be honest and critical with ourselves, because in that situation where mass unemployment wreaked havoc through Europe, the figures at that time are absolutely eye-watering. Unemployment in Greece was 50%, 40% in Spain. There was 20 European countries with youth unemployment over 20%. And the left should have had the answers to those problems. The left should have come forward with a manifesto of broad European manifesto of reflating the economy, of creating full employment, of addressing the crisis in public services and the welfare state, and addressing the climate crisis. And yet, that never happened. What actually happened was the right came to the fore. There were some exceptions, the odd exception, but generally it was the right that came. Populist, nationalistic movements came to the fore. And we saw the far right in Austria, Switzerland, Berlusconi, remember him, in Italy, Le Pen, the AfD in Germany. Across Europe we saw right-wing forces come to the fore. But there was a glimmer of hope, wasn't there, in 2017, at that election. There was a glimmer of hope when they told us that we could never win and we could never have a progressive government in the UK. The Tories were all powerful. Theresa May was so confident she called an early election. Labour were 20 odd points behind in the polls, and she was going to march to triumph and impose, was it 30 points?
It was more than that.
You should know. And remember that. And what happened was, we almost won. We were almost won. Why did we almost win? Because there was a manifesto that was put forward bravely by Jeremy that gave people hope. It wasn't his manifesto, it was ours. Absolutely. It wasn't ours. The press liked to portray it as the Corbyn project. Wasn't it? It involved huge numbers of people drawing up that manifesto. Huge numbers of people. He was the one who had to sell it to the country. And what happened then was that we didn't win. Came pretty close, but we didn't win. And in the run-up to that election, those who were advocating that type of policies were ridiculed, marginalised, all the usual stuff. When that election was so close, I'm struggling to find the words, but in Glasgow I'm sure I can say this. The establishment, and the only words I can describe, shat themselves. They absolutely shat themselves, because it was that manifesto was on the brink, and then that is when they acted. That's when they acted. So the whole force of the media, the corporations, the lobbyists, the power brokers across the world ensured that that was never ever going to be close again. And that's when we had the campaign of vilification against one of the most decent and honest politicians that you will ever find. And that's where we got to at that point. So why am I telling you this? Well, it would be easy to despair. It would be easy to sit and sink into a pit of despair and say, throw your hands up in the air and say, there's nothing we can do. But that isn't what they left. And that's not what working class people, and that's not what these people do or have done. Because the only thing we can do is the only thing we know we can do, and that is to regroup and reorganise and to look for inspiration from others. I hope you've been inspired by the people here today. I'm not particularly here to flog your book. I'm just saying that the theme of this book is about why we're here. But the reason I did it was that in that period of despair, we have to look to other people to inspire us. We have to look at those who have gone before us and those who are operating just now to lift our spirits and give us inspiration to say, well, you know what? There's an issue out there, there's an agenda out there that I actually feel passionate about. I'm not going to sit and ask somebody else to do it or expect somebody else to do it. I'm actually going to step up to the plate and do something about it myself. And that's what the people I've written about did. It's called If You Don't Run, They Can't Chase You. That's a quote from Michael McCarey, who is the legendary Scottish miners leader, or one of the leaders. And he said that if trade unionists don't stand up, if they don't turn round and face the people that are coming from them, if they just continue to run, then you'll continue to be chased down and ground down. And so that's what the people that I've been writing about, or I've interviewed, have done. And I'm just going to give you a flavour of some of them. people like Alistair Mackey, who's a man in his 90s now, who's a good friend of mine, and he was in this city working with the Scottish Daily Express. They were going to close down the paper. Now, you might think the Daily Express should be closed down, but maybe not at that time. And the workers set up a workers' cooperative to take on the bosses and take on and run the paper themselves. And of course, they had a bit of financial problems. And one Robert Maxwell, if people know him, the people in the audience will probably be too young, some of you to remember him. He came in as a white knight to save the paper, and then ensued a battle between the workers and Maxwell for the paper. But their story ultimately failed. Their workers' cooperative failed. But what it did show you was they were not willing to accept a big corporation just telling them their jobs are bust. And they produced that newspaper themselves, because the workers are the best people to know how to make the paper. Or people like Bryan Filling, who from very small beginnings in his front room started to organise the anti-apartheid campaign in Scotland. And it usually was a few folk in his front room. And somebody, they don't know who to this day, suggested that they give Nelson Mandela the freedom of the city of Glasgow at a time when he was being called a terrorist. This was in, I think, 1981. From that small idea, he got the freedom of the city of Glasgow, and that rippled worldwide, and over 130 or 140 cities worldwide gave Mandela the freedom of the city. And that shows you how from very small beginnings, things can grow. When Mandela was released, the first thing he wanted, one of the first things was to come to Glasgow, because to thank him for that. And Bryan was made the honorary consul for South Africa. What an achievement for that man. Or people, Dennis Skinner, who people will know as the MP, I interviewed him for the book and spoke to him about his commitment to the miners' strike. He told me he did over 300 public meetings in a year, and he gave every penny of his wages to the cause. Can you imagine the contrast between those, an MP like that, and those who have now got their snouts in the trough, working for the Caribbean, earning millions, and telling you that life as an MP doesn't give you enough money? Or Margaret Aspinall, whose son died at Hillsborough, and who has campaigned relentlessly since that day for justice for the Hillsborough families. And of course, again, they were proven right. And if we go right up to the present day, two friends of mine, Elaine Holmes and Olive McElroy, women who were implanted with vaginal mesh, who thought it was only them, who had been maimed by this product that was made by Johnson & Johnson, one of the biggest companies in the world, and yet who from almost nothing, being told by their GP that it was all in their head, built a campaign that went global, and we actually got mesh banned here. So there's many more. Some of these people who, sorry, I'll give you a final one. A woman, she goes under the name of Andrea. She is Scottish, and she's a socialist and activist in London. She works with homeless people. She met a guy on a demonstration who befriended her. They fell in love. She moved into her house, and they began a relationship that lasted a couple of years. It turns out he was an undercover police officer who was monitoring her and monitoring her friends and colleagues. She says, and I think quite rightly, that she feels as though she was raped by the state. Very powerful statement. But she was, when you think of it, because she was having a relationship with a person who wasn't who he said he was. And their campaigning, their research, and their campaigning on this has been absolutely phenomenal, exposing these police officers. I'll tell you what, there'll be plenty of those police officers in Glasgow this week monitoring all of you who were on demonstrations. In fact, could the undercover police officer in the room please identify?
Next to me.
So
At that point, you should all stand up.
So please look to these campaigners and campaigns, because they do give us inspiration and hope in dark times. And I kind of wonder who the people, these are some of them, who hopefully I'm going to write about in book 2. because it's the campaigners of today and tomorrow and the next day who will inspire us. The Labour movement's mantra is to educate, agitate and organise, and absolutely that we must stick to that. I hope that you go away from here with what these people have said, which I think has been absolutely tremendous, in your mind, and saying to yourself, what contribution can I make? Because don't sit and expect anyone else to step up. For some of the people I've written about, they were pointed at and told they were cranks. They were told they're mad until they actually proved what they were talking about, and it became generally accepted because they refused to accept the injustice against them. So, thanks very much. I'm delighted that these people came along and joined us today. I think their stories have been fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. That was absolutely fantastic. We've now got a few minutes for any points, questions that anyone wishes to raise. I think from the point of view of sound, if you speak your question out and I'll then repeat it so it goes into recording, I think that's probably necessary. I just say on the last point Neil made about undercover cops, there is an inquiry going on at the moment about undercover policing in the 1980s, 90s and onwards, which is disturbing and fascinating at the same time. And a good friend of ours, Steve Howell, who worked in our leadership and election campaigns, has just published a very good book called Collateral Damage, which describes exactly what Neil was talking about, how a peace group in the mid-1980s was infiltrated. I won't say any more than that because he won't buy the book otherwise. Called Collateral Damage. It's a very, very good book, and I enjoyed reading it, is the wrong way of describing it. I was fascinated to read it, and I recommend it. Right, questions? Yes, there, and then any other hands?
This side over here.
There, yeah, and yourself, yeah. Here.
Hiya, my name's Katie Gogley-Swan and I work on a project around the Global Green New Deal. And thank you everybody, it's been really inspiring. One point I would like to make is I think it's understandable for folk to have scepticism about the COP conference, but beyond the circus, beyond the hundreds of fossil fuel delegates in Bezos, I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the very critical negotiations that are taking place, that are the difference between life and death for millions of people around the world. And one of the things that are failing in negotiations at the moment is the financing question. Who is going to pay for the global transition to make sure every region and country around the world can support a just transition for their people? And if people have been following the negotiations, you'll know that at the start of the COP, this figure that advanced economies committed to of $100 billion every year was failed yet again. One of the organisations I work for, UNCTAD, has put out a figure. The realistic figure is $2.5 trillion per year if we're serious about keeping below 1.5 and if we're serious about the SDGs. My question is, after over a decade of crippling austerity, how do we speak to working class people in the UK about the need for a global just transition, and how do we make sure that the convenient lie that working class people don't care about other working class people in other parts of the world, how do we make sure that isn't a reality, and that we build solidarity here in the UK among working class people for that just transition in other parts of the world, and we don't lose disaffection in multilateralism and international solidarity?
Who wants to go on it? It's a very fundamental question. So let's take that one on its own, and then I'll take a group of questions after that, because we haven't got a vast amount of time. Who would like to deal with this question? Yeah, sure.
I couldn't agree with Katie anymore. I was one of those skeptics. I'm stealing a line from Col, who's in the audience, who organised the Friday for Future stuff. I was a skeptic till maybe 2 or 3 years ago, because I did see it as a middle class issue. I think for the first time, certainly in the streets of Glasgow in the last weekend, I've saw that cross-fertilisation of working class communities out on the street. If it's just middle class people that care about climate crisis in Glasgow, then there's a lot of middle class people in Glasgow because there's 150,000 people. It was the broadest, most dynamic demonstration I've seen since the anti-war movement. And I know that's anecdotal, and I get your point about the finances, but quite frankly, the only way these world leaders are going to sit up and listen and put their money where their mouth is if they're threatened, not only with being forced out of the ballot box, but their economies are shut down. That's the only way that we're actually going to hold them to account. That's why, for example, in Unite, we are ensuring through an international organising agenda that we are in control of certain areas of the UK economy, so that we can push that button with workers and say to whoever's in power, whether it's Keir Starmer or Boris Johnson or whoever, that we are the wealth creators in this country and we will shut down the economy if you do not give what workers need, whether that's on the climate or on a number of other things. So, you know, I'm not an economist like you. I'm not someone who knows the answer of, you know, how do we bridge that gap between 100 billion or what was it, 80 billion that we actually committed to. It's not even been raised, and the 1.2 trillion that's actually needed. All I know is people power is the only way that we can actually win that and bridge that gap.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that question? Very briefly, please. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more a comment. I think it's a great question. The point I wanted to make was around one of the things that the right's been very good at has been to problematise migration and refugees within that. And one of the risks, and we saw this, I think, with Boris Johnson when he was doing the kind of some stuff at the Coliseum a few weeks ago after the G20, when he talked about migration as what will come, mass migration, I think is the term he used, but if we don't get a grip of the climate emergency. And for me, and I think for a lot of other people on the left and a lot of people in migrant rights, the kind of like the antenna starts to go, that we've got to be very careful about how we respond to that, because that type of right-wing narrative can be put onto what might actually be a fact. People, if their homes and their lands have become unlivable, then people do need to move. People have always moved. That's a kind of normal human response, but the right will put a narrative onto that and will say, well, actually, this is a reason why you need to act in particular issues in the climate. And what it can do is create a kind of bordering policy, or it can strengthen the bordering policy within the global north, as we're seeing at the moment. So actually, the migration becomes a threat, and the right will talk about it as a threat. And then within that, what they'll do is they'll focus on individuals. You know, and currently, as I was saying when I was talking about refugees getting seen as this kind of threat, a really contortion of what seeking refugee protection and safety actually is. So it's more just a kind of comment alongside the question. It's about, I just think politically we need to be very, very aware of that risk of the right-wing narrative around migration, including within the kind of climate justice debates. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, somebody came out, I think, came out with a great sort of statement or phrase around this issue yesterday, when they spoke about if the Green movement want the Labour movement, or so we'll call them the Reds, to become more green, then the Greens must become more red as well. And I think there is that two-way relationship there that has to be built, and I think that it can be. In relation to COP, I would imagine that in this city, and certainly in my village, where I come from, there are people in that in my street who will feel as distant from what is going on in COP as a hill farmer in the Colombian mountains. There'll be no difference in the distance they feel from the power that's being exerted here. It's not geographical distance that matters, it's whatever impact that has on their lives. And I think that's the only way we can get us through, is where these issues affect people's lives in their everyday living. A good example being in Dumfries 2 weeks ago, the town's flooded. In that week, we see politicians all taking selfies with one another. Not one of them Not one government minister has visited the town of Dumfries to see the crisis that happened there. And that will be affecting working people in the centre of that town, again, because it happens now every few years. So I think it's building that relevance to people's lives, that this is how climate change is happening to you. And that's when people will come and vote.
It's the annual show, isn't it? It's Dumfries, it's Cumbria, it's York, it's Hull, and so on, all around the UK. And if you look at a map, 20 years' time, the coastal areas in east and west of Scotland, East Anglia, Somerset, South Wales are going to be sea. And that is the reality of what's happening. And it's the working class communities in all those places. They're going to lose their homes, lose their jobs, lose their livelihood, and be forced to move somewhere else. And there are already parts of the UK where you cannot buy or sell a house because of the prevalence of flooding going on there. We've got about quite a short time left. I've got two questions. May I take them together, please? There and yourself. Yeah, just those two, and then I'll ask all of the panel to respond briefly. Yes.
Well, first of all, it's a privilege for you to be here. It's very good to see you actually taking the time and effort to come to Glasgow. You know, politicians like you that make the difference, not the powers that be down in the blue zone. I can only agree with everything that's been said. I mean, the tradition of social justice in Glasgow, you just have to go to the Clyde and you see monuments to the sailors that went to fight for the Spanish Civil War. You see La Passionara, better to die on your feet than live on your knees. It's no doubt that there's funding being reduced to the council, right, which means that you don't get what's needed. It means that workers that should earn more, whether it's HGV drivers, bus drivers, they don't get enough. But the money comes from Westminster that dictates that. The refugee position is dictated by Westminster, not by Scotland. And much as I like Jeremy, and it was a disappointment to have that near miss, but it wasn't just the Tories that did that. Some Labour people did it too, whether it's Tom Watson or other people that stabbed you in the back. So it seems to me that whether or not you've all got good causes, we don't control the outcome because we don't control Westminster. And at the minute it's Tory, but even when it was Labour, it wasn't satisfactory either. My question is, given that we've got the socialist philosophy in the background, wouldn't it be better if we're independent and can get on and just do our own thing?
Thanks. Yes, yourself, Gary. We're taking the two questions together. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Mine is only like a short statement.
Sure.
Because we are from Catalonia, me and Danny. We come from CUP, which is a left party. In the candidacy unity is people. And it's only like to express our support to all your fights and struggles. Here we came here just these days for the People's Summit and the CUP coalition. And it was only like to express our support from Catalonia to all your struggles in Scotland for the social justice, to smash capitalism in your lands and in all the lands, and to express our internationalism as it's our flag as well fight. So it's been a pleasure and it's been really inspiring for us, for the CUP, and we invite you to share more things or more events or more information with us if possible. So just to make some strength or links. Here with Danny, who's actually a current member of the Catalan Parliament, and is what we are doing here. So again, all our support for you and long life to your struggles.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to be in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago when I spoke at the International Peace Bureau and took the time to meet and visit a lot of people around Barcelona. You're absolutely welcome here in Glasgow. Delighted to see you. Thank you for coming. Right, any responses to both of those questions? If everybody could say a word, it'd be very nice. Yeah.
So I'm here representing Scottish Hazards and Facts. So we have a position on devolution of health and safety. We don't have a position on independence, so I'm not going to give you a position on that. What I am going to say is that we are not hamstrung just now as a Scottish Parliament. We could be making a difference currently as a Scottish Parliament on many different aspects of health and safety, which is what my interest is. And I feel that the will is not there to do that. So on corporate homicide, for example, we could have introduced our own legislation on that would have brought people to account. There have been bills placed before Parliament numerous times over the past number of years, which have been stymied, which shouldn't have been. We have responsibility for health. We have responsibility for justice. There is a hell of a lot that we could be doing as a Scottish Parliament currently. We don't need independence to improve the health and safety of working people in Scotland.
Yeah, similarly, speaking on behalf of Live and Rent, I'm not going to take a position on the independence question today. I have my own opinions on that, but I just kind of wanted to draw a bit of a parallel between some of these threads and what happened at Kenmure Street back in May. Thinking to how there is this kind of broad idea of Scottish exceptionalism with how we would do things differently if we were independent. There was things that happened that day that certainly are under the Scottish Government's powers to handle differently, particularly around policing. And so for me, within all of the activism that I'm involved in, the route to independence, which I'm not against, which I voted for personally in 2014, should be built on these campaigns. It should be built through workers' power, and then we can have that discussion. I don't know how everyone else feels, but I can't think of a more depressing route to have to feel independence, given the way that the workers of this city have been treated by
I couldn't have put it better than Ruth. I support independence. I did in 2014 and still do. But the Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council have proven what kind of independent Scotland they would actually have, which is one based in neoliberalism. It's one based on a slightly more socially progressive, even though I don't really see that rhetoric, than Westminster. But just to touch upon a point that the comrade made about how we almost have to have the right party in power or political, and Jeremy will disagree with me on this, but the power of people is what forces their hand, whether it be...
How do you know that it's agree with you?
You're the number one person that would agree with me on that. What I'm saying is it doesn't need to be through Westminster. That was my point. It's that Westminster, for me, it needs to be extra parliamentary. That's what we've learned. And I don't know why I'm saying that, because Jeremy's been part of every extra parliamentary group that I've ever been involved
I'm
in.
really struggling to understand why I'm supposed to be disagreeing.
What I'm saying is political. I've never been in the Labour Party, but I hope that the Labour Party wins power in Westminster, and I hope that they win power up in Scotland. What I'm trying to say is that it's the people that demand that. The people created the Labour Party, the trade union movement created the Labour Party, and we are the ones that can actually demand better and more radical movement in society, not just whoever is in power. But that, yeah, I mean, we saw that in the last week, and I think it's possible from now on.
Thank you.
Yeah, Scottish Refugee Council is in a position on independence. It's difficult sometimes for us in this debate, because we see the full horrors every day walking through our doors of what it does to people, the asylum and immigration system. So that pressure's there, but we don't have a formal position in this. But what I would say is that, I'll give you a very brief example. The Scottish Parliament has a lot of legislative competence powers, and the UK immigration asylum system routinely makes people destitution. It uses destitution as a tool of deterrence and control over people, including the asylum system. A few years ago, a group of campaigners, from civil society and communities came together and lobbied Mary Fee and Christina McKelvey for the Colleagues and Human Rights Committee in the Scottish Parliament to say, no, there's nothing happening here to deal with destitution as it affects not only people in Glasgow who are refused through the asylum process, but also in terms of that wider group of people who have insecure immigration status, like domestic abuse survivors that had their leave tied to their partner who was abusive, or increasingly EU workers who could not fulfil residency rights. And this was before, just at the time Brexit was occurring. And, Christina and Mary, to their credit, SNP Labour came together and says, you're right, we need to do something for this. They held an inquiry, the Hidden Lives New Beginnings report was published, placed recommendations. I spoke with the Scottish Government after it. The Scottish Government said, there's a lot of recommendations here for us. And I said, yes, absolutely. That was the point of this inquiry. It wasn't about critiquing, which we all can agree on, the UK government's inhumane policy. It was actually about what can we do within devolved competence to deal with this. And we've now got a national strategy. I mean, there's a lot of question marks around how deliverable, how much of a difference that's making, but it's progress. It's a national strategy with some resources again around it to try and prevent and mitigate immigration and just destitution in Scotland. And the reason we've done that is to say, even aside from the independence abolition question, people are street homeless, people are being exploited, people are having to make survival decisions. We can't tolerate that if we're human rights defenders. We can't allow that to happen. So I think it's really important not to only look at these things through, that's my point really, independence devolution lens, and always look at it through a human rights lens, and ideally an international struggle lens, because then that's what generates the questions and the scrutiny and the accountability that in practice can make a difference. Because otherwise, if it just stays with our independence devolution debates, that becomes, maybe unintentionally for well-intentioned people, it paralyses action. We need to just say that's not the right to the it's human rights and internationalism.
Thank you. Now to conclude, Neil.
Yeah, I actually think that question, I'm sorry, first of all, thank you to Catalonian friends for coming along. That's very greatly appreciated, and I hope you have been inspired by these people today. I think your question sort of encapsulates, I think, the somewhat depressing state of Scottish politics at the moment, where the polarisation of opinion between whether you're pro or against independence becomes a de facto argument for everything from dog shit to international crime. Whether everything is seen through that lens. Everything is seen through that lens. You cannot have a debate about whether you support working people and struggle in the city of Glasgow, that it becomes a constitutional argument. What a depressing state that is, because I don't know you, sir, and you don't know me, but I probably wouldn't be far wrong to say I have a lot more in common with you than I ever will with Mike Russell or Angus Robertson or some of these people, or Tony Blair for that matter. So I think whether you take that position in the Constitution and I take another position, I think that's not what should divide us. What should unite us is that we're campaigning for our class and our people. And I will never put waving a flag before that, I have to say. I respect very greatly people who take a different position from me on the Constitution. But where I will always argue with you is when everything becomes an argument about that and overtakes what we're trying to do for our people.
I thank all of our panel who've been phenomenal this afternoon. Interesting, exciting, informative, but above all, inspirational. Thank all of you for coming. I'm going to ask you to put your hands together to thank those volunteers and staff members of the project, of this venue, of so many good friends here in Glasgow who've made sure that this venue is operating 4